The morning Kate Hawthorne threw Calvin Blackwell's signed partnership agreement back across the table at him. The ink was barely dry, and her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled like a rattlesnake's tail. "You told me this was what you wanted," she said, and her voice came out low and dangerous, the kind of quiet that meant she was 2 seconds from either crying or drawing a pistol, and she hadn't decided which yet. "You stood right there in front of me and said, 'No wife, no marriage, just a partner, someone to ride beside you, someone to work the land and split the profit and not ask for anything more.'" She pressed both palms flat on the rough-hewn table between them. "I said that was fine by me. I said that was exactly what I wanted too." Calvin didn't move. He stood near the window of the Blackwell Ranch house, the Arizona Territory sun cutting a hard line across his jaw, and he looked at that paper like it had personally betrayed him. "Kate, do not say my name like that." Her green eyes were burning. "Like I'm something fragile, like I'm something you have to manage. You sat across from me 6 months ago and told me you were done with entanglements. Done with complications. You needed someone who could handle a rifle and a ledger book in equal measure, someone who understood that the Blackwell land came first and feelings came last, or not at all. I remember what I said." "Then explain to me," she snapped, "why you just rode into redemption and told Deputy Holt that I was your wife." The silence between them was enormous, the kind that fills a room completely and presses against every wall. Calvin Blackwell turned from the window. His dark eyes met hers, and there was something in them she had never seen before, something unguarded and raw and terrible in its honesty. "Because when Royce Callahan told me what he was planning to do to you," Calvin said quietly, "partner didn't sound like enough protection. And that was the truth that cracked everything open between them. That was the hidden motive underneath 6 months of careful distance, 6 months of Kate telling herself that the arrangement was perfect, that she didn't want more, that the flicker she felt every time Calvin Blackwell looked at her was nothing more than admiration between two competent people. That was the moment the whole careful architecture of what they had built came tumbling down, and everything they had been refusing to feel came flooding through the ruins. But to understand how they arrived at that table, at that morning, at that impossible and breathtaking truth, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back 6 months to the advertisement in the Tucson Gazette, to a woman with $34 and a surveyor's map, and absolutely no intention of ever letting anyone break her heart again. Kate Hawthorne had come west because she had no other direction to run. She was 27 years old in the autumn of 1882, which meant she had been born in the same year the Civil War began, and she sometimes felt like she had been shaped by that coincidence, forged in the fires of something larger than herself, tempered into someone harder than she would have chosen to be. She had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher mother and a surveyor father who had taught her that the land was a language you could learn to read if you were patient enough and smart enough and willing enough to get your boots dirty. Her father, Thomas Hawthorne, had spent 12 years mapping the territories west of the Mississippi for the federal government, sending home letters full of description, so vivid that Kate had grown up believing the West was a kind of paradise wide and clean, and honest in a way that the city was not. When he died of a fever in New Mexico Territory in 1877, he left Kate two things: a collection of survey maps she had studied until she could read topography the way other women read novels, and a conviction that the land he loved was worth going to find. Her mother had remarried quickly, too quickly, Kate had thought at the time, and the stepfather had been the kind of man who smiled at you while he was stealing from you, and Kate had learned to recognize that particular smile in other men after that. It had made her cautious. It had made her perhaps too cautious, and for a time she had thought that caution was wisdom. She had almost married a banker in Cincinnati named Gerald Fowler, who had a clean suit and a soft handshake, and who turned out, 18 months into their courtship, to have a dark past that involved another woman entirely, a woman in Louisville who had every legal claim to his affection that Kate had been promised. The discovery had not broken her heart as much as it had broken her faith in her own judgment, which was worse. She had been wrong about him in a fundamental way, and that wrongness had felt like a wound that didn't close cleanly. So at 26, she had packed everything she owned into 2 leather bags, taken the last of her mother's small inheritance, and gone to Tucson to find work that matched her skills. She had figured that a woman who could read a topographic survey and manage basic accounts and shoot a rifle well enough to be useful, her father had insisted on that, at least, should be employable somewhere in the Arizona territory, where the land was being divided and settled and sold at a rate that kept surveyors busy. She had been right about that. She found work quickly, first assisting a land office, then taking independent contracts for small-scale surveys of ranching parcels. It was solitary work, often uncomfortable, occasionally frightening, and she loved it with a completeness that surprised her. Out in the open country with her instruments and her maps and the great indifferent beauty of the desert around her, she felt most fully like herself. And then the advertisement had appeared in the Tucson Gazette on a Tuesday in September. It read, "Wanted. A capable partner for the operational management of Blackwell Ranch, 12,000 acres, Redemption County, Arizona Territory. Applicant must be literate, numerate, experienced with livestock and land, willing to work under difficult conditions and weather. I am not seeking a domestic arrangement. This is a business partnership with shared profit and shared decision-making authority. No permanent ties required. Inquire at the Gazette office for C. Blackwell." Kate had read it 3 times. Then she had walked to the Gazette office, dictated her qualifications to the clerk, and sent a letter to C. Blackwell of Redemption County that very afternoon. What she had not expected was that C. Blackwell would write back the same week. What she had not expected was that the letter would be 5 pages long, detailed and precise and surprisingly eloquent, laying out the full scope of the operation, the cattle numbers, the water rights disputes, the fencing needs, the proximity to the new railroad spur that was changing everything about the regional market. What she had not expected was that C. Blackwell would be a man who wrote the way some men talked, directly, without ornament, but with a kind of careful intelligence underneath every sentence that told you he was thinking harder than he was showing. And she had not expected to be so thoroughly interested. She had written back immediately, just as precisely, with her own qualifications laid out in full, including a frank admission that she was a woman and an awareness that this might change his interest in the arrangement. She had written it plainly because she was tired of not being plain. She had included a copy of one of her survey assessments as proof of competence. His response had arrived 6 days later. It said, "Your qualifications are the best I have received. The fact that you are a woman is your own business and not mine. If you can do the work is yours. Terms to be negotiated in person. Come to Redemption at your convenience and we will discuss the arrangement." C. Blackwell. She had been on the stage to Redemption 4 days after that. The town of Redemption, Arizona Territory, was exactly what its name suggested it was, a place where people came when they needed a second chance at something, and where the desert made no guarantees about what that second chance would look like. It had a main street with the essential establishments, a general store, a post office, a barber, a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's, a saloon called the Copper Spur that was louder than necessary, a small church, and a land office that Kate immediately cataloged as understaffed. The streets were hard-packed dirt, and the buildings were mostly board and adobe, and the whole town had an unfinished quality, like it was still in the process of deciding what it wanted to be when it grew up. Calvin Blackwell was waiting at the stage stop, which she had not expected. She had expected to find her own way out to the ranch, to negotiate her own introduction, to arrive on her own terms. Instead, there he was, standing beside a dark bay horse with a second horse hitched behind it, and he was taller than she had imagined and more angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock as the mesa behind the town, and dark eyes that took her measure in a single glance with an efficiency she recognized immediately because she did the same thing herself. "Kate Hawthorne," he said. "Calvin Blackwell," she replied, and they shook hands the way two business partners shook hands, firmly and without ceremony, and if her pulse did something unexpected at the contact, she filed that information away under irrelevant and moved on. "Stage ride was long," he said. "They always are. I've got your horse. Ranch is 6 miles out. We can talk on the way if you want." "That's practical," she said. They talked on the way, and the 6 miles went faster than either of them remarked on. He told her about the ranch. His father had built it. His father had died 4 years ago of a heart that had finally given out under the weight of everything he'd tried to carry. And Calvin had inherited both the land and the debts, and the unfinished business of making something viable out of it. He was 32. He mentioned this only because it was relevant to how long he'd been working the place, and he had learned ranching from the ground up in the way that people learned things when there was no alternative. He had a foreman named Hector Ruiz who had been with the ranch for 11 years and who knew the land better than anyone alive. He had 6 hands. He had 800 head of cattle and a horse breeding operation that he was developing carefully, because the horses were where the real money was starting to be, with the railroad needing quality animals and the cavalry contracting locally. He did not tell her why he had specifically requested a partner rather than a hired hand. He did not tell her what the word wife meant to him, or why he had excluded it so deliberately from the advertisement. Those were the things she would learn later, the things that lived in the hidden territory between what he said and what he meant. Kate told him about her surveying work, her experience with land records and water rights, her background in her father's work. She was direct about the gaps in her knowledge. She knew cattle management in theory and not yet in practice, and she was honest about that. He nodded as she talked, and she noticed that he was actually listening, not just waiting for her to finish so he could respond, and that was rarer than it should have been. The ranch itself stole her breath when she first saw it. It sat at the base of a long, rocky ridge that ran north to south, sheltered from the worst of the summer wind, with a creek that ran reliably through the back quarter of the property, something precious, and therefore contested in that dry country. The main house was solid stone and timber, low and long, built to last. The outbuildings were numerous and well-maintained. The grazing land stretched south and east in a broad sweep of bunch grass and mesquite that looked, to Kate's land-reading eye, like it was being used carefully rather than carelessly. "You know what you're doing with this land," she said, looking out from the ridge. "Trying to," he said. They negotiated the partnership agreement that evening at the kitchen table, just the two of them with a kerosene lamp and a pot of coffee and a clean sheet of paper between them. It took 2 hours. Kate had come with her own set of requirements worked out in her head, and Calvin had clearly thought through his as well, and they disagreed on 3 separate points and compromised on all 3, and by the end of it, they had an arrangement that was fair and detailed and binding. 40% of the ranch's net annual profit would go to Kate in exchange for her operational management responsibilities, bookkeeping, supply contracting, survey work as needed for the ongoing water rights case, and general partnership in major decisions. She would live at the ranch in the east bedroom of the main house, which was separated from Calvin's quarters by a long common room. She would work alongside him but with her own defined areas of authority. Either party could dissolve the arrangement with 90 days' notice. There was no personal obligation in either direction beyond the professional. "This is what you want," Calvin said when they had both read it through. It was not quite a question. "This is exactly what I want," Kate said. "I don't need a husband. I've managed my own affairs for years and I intend to keep doing it. I need a good working arrangement with someone I can respect, somewhere I can build something real." Something moved through his expression, very quickly, too quickly for her to read it clearly. Then it was gone. "That suits me fine," he said. "I don't have room in my life for anything more than the work. That's not going to change." "Understood," she said. They shook hands again, the same firm, clean handshake as before, and Kate told herself she was entirely satisfied with the arrangement, and she almost believed it. The first weeks were a careful calibration of two strong-willed people learning each other's rhythms without admitting they were doing it. Kate was up at dawn every morning, which she discovered matched Calvin's schedule exactly, and they established a wordless routine of coffee at the kitchen table before the day began, reviewing the previous day's work and the current day's needs with the same quiet efficiency that Kate recognized as the most functional kind of communication she had ever experienced with another person. He was not easy. She noticed that clearly and without judgment. Calvin Blackwell was a man who had built walls around himself so thoroughly that the walls had become load-bearing. Remove them, and something essential would collapse. He was private in a way that went beyond preference into something closer to necessity. He was fair in his dealings with the hands and with Kate, scrupulously so, as if fairness was the one virtue he had decided he could offer without risk. He worked harder than any man she had ever seen work, arriving at things first and leaving last, and she recognized in that work ethic the familiar shape of someone who was trying to outrun something. She didn't ask what. That was not the arrangement. What she noticed instead were the smaller things, the things that accumulated without her permission. The way he always made sure her coffee cup was refilled before his own. The time she came back from a boundary survey in the rain to find her boots set by the fire to dry and fresh coffee waiting, no explanation given or sought. The evening she sat at the kitchen table trying to untangle a discrepancy in the water rights records, a legal knot that had been keeping the ranch from full use of the creek, and he sat across from her for 3 hours without speaking but clearly thinking, until he suddenly said, "The original 1874 grant." It listed the creek by the Spanish name. The 1879 filing used the English translation. The county recorder indexed them separately. They're the same water. And he was right, and it solved the problem entirely. And when Kate looked up at him, her expression must have given something away, because he looked quickly back at the paper and said it was just a filing error, and she said yes, just a filing error, and they both went back to work. She began to understand the history of the land by reading Calvin's relationship to it. He knew every acre with the specificity of a man who had walked each one under every condition, in every season. He knew where the creek ran shallowest in July, where the cattle sought shade in the worst heat, where the south fence needed reinforcing every spring because of the wash. He carried the ranch the way some people carried a grief, something that had become so much a part of his physical self that he could no longer imagine existing without its weight. She learned this the evening he took her out to the far eastern pasture to see the horses, the breeding stock he was developing, and he stood at the fence in the early evening light and watched a young dark mare move across the grass with an expression on his face that Kate could only describe as love, not sentiment. Something deeper and steadier than sentiment, something that had survived everything else that had not. "She's extraordinary," Kate said, and she meant the horse, but she was watching him. "She'll throw good colts," he said. "If I get the breeding right, this ranch could be something important in another 5 years. The cavalry's going to need remount horses as they push further into the territory. The quality market is opening up." He paused. "My father never got to see it turn the corner. He died thinking it was still a fight he was losing." It was the most he had said about his father in 6 weeks. Kate kept her eyes on the horse. "Was he wrong?" she asked carefully. "He was winning," Calvin said. "He just didn't know it." The silence after that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that means two people have understood something together that neither of them has said out loud. The trouble with Royce Callahan began in October, about 8 weeks after Kate had arrived. Royce Callahan was not the kind of trouble you could see coming from far away. He was the kind that looked like opportunity until you were already inside the trap. He ran the Callahan Cattlemen's Company out of a large operation 20 miles south, and he had the appearance of legitimate prosperity: fine clothes, a polished manner, a willingness to buy drinks for every man at the Copper Spur, and tell them all how much he admired their independence, right up to the moment he made them an offer they could not refuse. He had been acquiring land in Redemption County steadily for 3 years, and the Blackwell Ranch sat at the center of his geography like a keystone. He came to the ranch the first time on a polite pretense, a neighboring rancher's courtesy visit, he called it, bringing a bottle of whiskey and a warm handshake, and a set of eyes that moved around the main house with the quiet, acquisitive hunger of a man taking inventory. He was pleasant to Kate in the way that made her skin prickle, too interested in her specifically, too curious about her arrangement with Calvin, asking questions wrapped in compliments that were designed to seem casual, but were really designed to determine exactly what her position here was and how it could be leveraged. After he left, Kate sat at the kitchen table and looked at Calvin. "He's not interested in being a neighbor," she said. Calvin's jaw was tight. "He's been trying to buy this ranch for 2 years before I took over. My father turned him down 4 times. He's going to try a different approach this time," she said. "I know it. He was looking at the survey marks. When we walked him past the east pasture, he was looking at the creek access." Calvin looked at her. "You caught that? My father was a surveyor. I know when someone's reading land." A moment passed between them, a quick, charged recognition, and then Calvin looked away and said they'd need to file an update to the water rights claim before the end of the year. And Kate said she had already begun drafting it. And they moved back into the comfortable efficiency of their work, and neither of them acknowledged what had just happened, which was that they had understood each other with a completeness that was starting to feel like something far more dangerous than a business arrangement. October became November, and the Arizona Territory autumn settled into cool nights and sharp mornings, with a sky so wide and blue it looked like something out of a fever dream. Kate had developed a habit of walking the eastern ridge in the early mornings before the workday began, not for any practical reason, but because the view from up there showed her the full scope of the ranch laid out below, the organized beauty of it, the careful work of years visible in the shape of every fence line and water trough and outbuilding. She felt, in a way she could not have explained without sounding ridiculous, that she was looking at something alive. Calvin found her there one morning and did not seem surprised to find her there, which meant he had noticed the habit. He stood beside her and looked at the land below and said nothing for a long time, which was one of the things about him she had come to trust absolutely, that when he didn't speak, it meant he was thinking and not ignoring her, and when he did speak, it meant what it said. "My mother used to stand up here," he said eventually. "Before she left." Kate did not respond. She let him have the space of it. She couldn't take the isolation, the work. "She went back to her family in San Antonio when I was 11. My father he was never quite the same after." A pause. "He loved the ranch more than he loved her, I think, or he didn't know how to love both at the same time. And she couldn't live second to a piece of land." "That was the shape of things in your house growing up," Kate said quietly, not a question. "That was exactly the shape," he said, "and I swore I wouldn't repeat it. I wouldn't ask someone to stand in that position, so I stopped asking." He looked at the land. "The ranch is my whole life, Kate. I don't know how to be anything else. I don't have anything else to offer." "Nobody asked you to offer anything," she said. He looked at her then, fully and directly, and what was in his face in that moment was something she was not prepared for. It was relief, and it was longing, and it was the specific expression of a man who was desperately hoping that something was true while being completely convinced that it couldn't be. "No," he said. "Nobody did." She made herself look back at the land below, and she made herself feel nothing, and she was not entirely successful at either. Hector Ruiz, the foreman, had been watching the two of them with the patient amusement of a man who knew exactly how a story was going to end long before the principals figured it out. He was 53 years old, had been in this country his entire life, had served 3 different owners of this land, and chosen to stay with the Blackwells because he respected Thomas Blackwell and respected Calvin more, and he had a particular gift for knowing when something was real and when something was pretending to be nothing. "Boss doesn't know what he's got," he told his wife Maria one evening in their small house at the edge of the ranch property, after he had watched Calvin spend 45 minutes explaining the horse breeding program to Kate with an intensity and care that had nothing to do with the breeding program. "He knows," Maria said serenely, stirring something on the stove. "He's just afraid." "Then somebody ought to tell him what happens when you're afraid of something real." "Hector," his wife said, "let it find its own way." It found its way, as most things did, through crisis. The water rights case came to a head in late November, and it brought with it the revelation of Royce Callahan's true methods. Kate had been building the case for the Blackwell Ranch's claim to its full historic creek access for 2 months, working from her father's survey maps and the original land grant documents and the county records, and she had constructed what she believed was an airtight legal argument. She had hired a lawyer in Tucson named Philip Dawes, who had a reputation for honest dealing in land cases. What she discovered, through a combination of Dawes' research and her own instinct, was that Callahan had been paying the county recorder's assistant to misfile documents, specifically the original 1874 water grant, and had then submitted a competing claim based on the gaps the misfiling created. It was fraud. It was also extremely difficult to prove without the original documents, which had mysteriously been lost from the county records office. Kate had her father's copies. She had carried his survey maps west with her, and among them was a complete set of the original territory surveys from 1874, including the creek grant. Her father had surveyed this land himself. His initials were on the maps. His handwriting was on the notations. When she laid this out for Calvin at the kitchen table, he looked at the maps, and then he looked at her, and she saw something shift in his face that she could not interpret, a kind of wonder, perhaps, or the specific disorientation of a man who had been fighting a battle for years, and suddenly found that the weapon he needed had been sitting right in front of him. "Your father surveyed this land," he said, "in 1874. He noted the creek access specifically. See there, his initials, T.H. Thomas Hawthorne." She traced the notation with her finger. "It's his handwriting. I can provide sworn testimony to that effect. Any document examiner would confirm it." Calvin was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "These maps are what you brought with you from Cincinnati." "Yes. You brought your father's work west." "I always intended to." She paused. "I knew there were water rights disputes all over the territory. I thought the maps might be useful someday. I didn't know." She stopped. "You didn't know they were going to be useful here," he said. "No." He reached out and touched the edge of the survey map with the particular reverence of a man who understood what a piece of paper could mean when everything depended on it. His hand was close to hers. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Kate," he said in a different voice than the voice he usually used, and she felt something in her chest tighten sharply. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Let's get this filed first." He pulled his hand back. "Right," he said. "Yes, let's file it." They filed the documentation with the Tucson Land Court in early December, and the competing claim Callahan had been building collapsed within a week. The county recorder's assistant was arrested. Philip Dawes sent a telegram saying the case was closed in their favor. Calvin read the telegram twice and set it on the table and went outside, and Kate looked out the window a few minutes later and saw him standing in the east pasture by the horse fence in the December wind with his hat in his hand, and she understood that he was giving himself the private space to feel something that was too large for indoors. She gave him that space. She made coffee and set his cup by the fire to stay warm, and when he came back inside, he sat down and picked up the cup and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was carefully level and carrying a full weight of everything he wasn't saying. "It was your father's land," she said. "It should stay that way." Callahan did not take the loss graciously. That had been the predictable part. What had not been predictable was what he did next, which was the thing that had brought Kate and Calvin to the moment at the table that January morning, to the paper and the shaking hands and the word wife said like it was protection. What Callahan did was send 2 of his men to find Kate on a solo boundary survey she was running in early January, in the remote northeast corner of the ranch, where the ridge broke down into a series of arroyos that made the terrain complicated and concealing. The men told her that Callahan wanted to meet. The way they told her made it clear it was not optional. She was alone. She was armed. She always carried a rifle on survey work, and the Colt revolver her father had given her that sat in a holster at her hip. But 2 against 1 in an arroyo with no lines of sight was not a position that lent itself to favorable outcomes. She had gone with them, calculating that the meeting itself was more survivable than the alternative, and she had sat across from Royce Callahan in a canvas field tent. He had set up in the arroyo like a man who fully expected to be comfortable in his criminal undertakings, and he had offered her money. Specifically, he had offered her enough money to set herself up anywhere she chose, in exchange for her signature on a document that would reassign her partnership share of the Blackwell Ranch to the Callahan Cattlemen's Company. He had framed it as a business transaction. He had been impeccably polite about it. He had also made it entirely clear, with no specific threat she could quote precisely, but with a certainty she felt in her bones, that declining was not going to lead anywhere she wanted to go. "You're a practical woman," Callahan said, leaning back in his camp chair. He was in his mid-40s, handsome in a cold-eyed way, wearing clothes that cost more than most families in redemption made in a month. "Blackwell is going to lose this ranch eventually. He doesn't have the capital to develop it the way it needs. Take my offer and walk away clean." "And if I don't," Kate said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I think you're smart enough not to require a more specific answer than that." She had looked at him steadily and said she would consider it and needed time, which bought her 24 hours, and she had ridden back to the ranch in the gathering dark with her heart hammering and her mind working through every angle as fast as she could manage. She had gone to Calvin immediately, which was not what she would have done 3 months earlier, when the arrangement was newer, and her pride had not yet learned to distinguish between useful independence and dangerous stubbornness. She told him everything, including the specific language Callahan had used, including the names of the 2 men, including the location of the field tent. Calvin listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she finished, the silence in the kitchen lasted about 4 seconds. Then he stood up, and something in his face had changed in a way she had not seen before. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it, but something more fundamental, something that looked like a man who has discovered that the thing he most wanted to protect is in danger and is now orienting his entire self toward that protection. "He's not going to touch you," Calvin said. "That's not the part I need you to address," Kate said. "I can manage my own safety. What I need is a plan that resolves this without bloodshed, because Callahan has powerful friends, and the wrong kind of confrontation ends badly for the ranch regardless of who wins the fight." He looked at her with something that might have been frustration and might have been admiration. "You're right," he said. "I know, so let's think." They sat up until 2 in the morning thinking. Hector was brought in because Hector knew the county politics and the personalities involved. A plan was built that involved going to Deputy Marshal James Holt in redemption, not the local town sheriff, who had a relationship with Callahan that made his independence questionable, but Holt, who was a federal appointment and who had been watching Callahan's land acquisitions with interest, and presenting the full documented case for what amounted to coercion and attempted fraud. It was during this planning that Calvin had ridden into redemption to speak with Holt, and it was during that conversation that he had said it, had called Kate his wife, had framed the coercion as an attack not on a business partner but on his wife. Because in the moment when Holt had asked him to define Kate's relationship to the ranch for the legal record, the word partner had seemed like it left her exposed, like it described something provisional and removable. And the instinct to make her protection absolute had overridden everything else. And Holt had told someone because small towns were made of secrets that leaked, and the word had gotten back to Kate before Calvin could explain it himself. So there they were, January morning. Cold light through the window, paper on the table between them. Partner didn't sound like enough protection, he had said. Kate stood very still for a long moment. The shaking in her hands had stopped, replaced by a stillness that was something other than calm. Calvin, she said carefully, that is not a reason to— I know, he said. I know what it isn't, and I know what we agreed to. I'm not going back on that. I was trying to protect you and I overstepped, and I'll go back to Holt and correct the record today if that's what you want. Is that what you want? He went quiet. He turned back to the window. The morning light was hard on his face. No, he said. It's not what I want. But what I want is not the arrangement, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not going to make you choose between something you never agreed to and leaving. The room was so quiet she could hear the wind off the ridge. Calvin, she said, and her voice was different now, softer and more careful, carrying something she had been working very hard for months not to carry. Look at me. He turned. When I said that the arrangement was exactly what I wanted, she said slowly, I meant it. I meant it when I said it. I was not pretending for your benefit or mine. I genuinely believed that a clean professional partnership was what I needed and what I was capable of. She paused, and something moved across her face that was either honesty or courage or both at once. And then I spent 6 months here, learning this land, working with you. Watching you fight for something you love in a way that— she stopped, tried again. You are the most honest person I have encountered in my adult life. Not just honest about facts, honest about what you are and what you're not. And that is— another pause. That is not easy to be unmoved by. Calvin did not speak. He was watching her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she didn't. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I'm not asking you to change the arrangement or make me promises or say things you don't mean. I'm just being honest because you were, and because I think we've both been carrying something for several months that has been significantly heavier than it needed to be. He crossed the room. He did not do it quickly. He crossed the kitchen floor with the deliberate certainty of a man who has made a decision after long deliberation and is entirely committed to it. And he stopped in front of her and put his hands on her face, very gently, with the same careful precision he brought to everything he valued, and he looked at her for a long moment. I don't want a wife, he said. I want you. Those are different things, and I've been confusing myself by not admitting it. Kate's breath came out unevenly. That is possibly the least romantic declaration in the history of the Arizona Territory. I'm not good at romantic, he said. I'm good at honest. I know, she said. That's the problem. He kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that had been building for 6 months and felt like it, unhurried and certain, and carrying the full weight of every conversation and every morning on the ridge, and every moment they had refused to acknowledge what was happening between them. Kate's hands went to his jacket lapels, and she felt the roughness of the worn wool under her fingers and the solid reality of him, and something in her chest that had been wound tight for a long time came loose all at once. They stood in the cold January morning of the ranch kitchen for a considerable amount of time, and neither of them had any interest in the paper on the table. The question of Royce Callahan, however, had not resolved itself in the night. Deputy Marshal James Holt was a careful man, which was what made him effective and what sometimes made him slow. He listened to the full case Calvin and Kate brought to him in his office 2 days later: the coercion, the original land fraud, the attempted document forgery, the armed escort that had compelled Kate to a meeting, and he agreed that it was substantial and serious, and that it needed to be addressed. He also said he needed 3 more days to collect the additional sworn statements that would make the case bulletproof, because Callahan had a lawyer in Phoenix and a political connection in Prescott, and Holt wanted no procedural gap that could be used as an escape. Those 3 days were tense in the particular way that the space before resolution is always tense. You know the storm is coming, you just don't know exactly when it breaks. Kate and Calvin had settled into something new between them, something that was still figuring out its own shape, warm and careful, and carrying the same quality of precision that characterized everything they did together. She noticed that he looked at her differently now, not constantly and conspicuously, but in the small private moments, across the kitchen table, at the end of a long day in the yard, with the expression of a man who is newly amazed by a discovery that was there all along. She noticed that she did not find the expression alarming. She found it, against all the careful defenses she had constructed over the past several years, deeply gratifying. She also noticed that she was not afraid in the way she had been afraid after Gerald Fowler. There was no hidden version of Calvin Blackwell she hadn't met. The walls he had built were walls he had built honestly, out of the materials of his real history, for reasons she understood and could respect even as she watched them come down. There was no dark past he was concealing. Or rather, the dark parts of his past were the ones he had already shown her, and they were the kind of darkness that came from loss and work and loving something fiercely and being hurt by it, not the kind that came from deception. "You trust me," he said one evening, not quite believing it. "You've given me consistent reason to," she said. "That's the entire basis of trust. Most people overlook that." He was quiet for a moment, then, he stopped. "Tried again." "I haven't let anyone, I know," she said. Calvin," she said gently. "You don't have to have the words. I can tell." He looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded it almost hurt to see, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they stayed like that for a while in the quiet lamplight of the ranch house kitchen with the winter wind outside and the land they had both fought to protect stretched out around them in the dark. Holt made his move on Callahan 3 days later, as promised. He had the sworn statements he needed from Kate, from 2 of Callahan's own former employees who had been willing to speak, once the process had reached the point where their cooperation offered more safety than their silence, and from the county clerk in Tucson who had discovered additional evidence of the record's manipulation. He rode out to the Callahan Cattlemen's Company with 2 federal deputies and a warrant, and by the following morning Royce Callahan was in the Redemption County Jail awaiting transport to the federal court in Prescott. Kate heard the news from Hector, who had ridden in from town with it, and she stood in the yard and felt the release of the tension she had been carrying so consistently that she had almost stopped feeling it as tension and had started feeling it as weather. Calvin came out of the barn and read her face and then looked at Hector, who nodded. "It's done," Kate said. He walked to her across the hard winter dirt of the yard, and he didn't say anything, just put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close to his side, and she leaned into him briefly, just briefly, allowing herself that much, and Hector very carefully turned his horse and rode back to the bunkhouse without appearing to notice any of it. The charges against Callahan held. His lawyer came up from Phoenix and argued vigorously for 2 weeks in the Prescott federal court, but the documentation was too thorough and the witnesses too consistent, and Royce Callahan was convicted of land fraud, coercion, and conspiracy in February of 1883 and sentenced to 7 years in the federal penitentiary at Yuma. The land he had acquired through fraudulent means, 3 neighboring ranches whose owners had been pressured into selling, was returned to their original owners. The Callahan Cattlemen's Company dissolved within a month of the conviction. The Blackwell Ranch was safe. More than safe. The resolution of the water rights case, now permanently settled in their favor with the 1874 survey documents entered into the federal record, had opened up the full creek access Calvin needed to expand the horse breeding program. Kate spent February and March redesigning the water management system for the property, drawing on her father's survey knowledge and a civil engineering manual she had ordered from a bookshop in Tucson, and what she produced was both technically elegant and practically transformative. The creek would now feed 3 additional grazing sections in a rotation system that would support twice the current cattle and horse numbers without overtaxing the land. Calvin watched her work on it over several evenings, the plans spread across the kitchen table, and he contributed the practical knowledge of the land that her theory needed to become real. Where the ground was too hard to trench, where the natural grade could be used instead of engineered, where the mesquite roots would defeat any piping within 2 seasons. They worked together the way they had always worked, precisely and complementarily, except that now occasionally one of them would look up from the plans and find the other already looking, and neither of them pretended that wasn't happening. Spring arrived in the Arizona territory with a color and warmth that Kate found almost aggressive in its beauty. The desert bloomed in ways she hadn't been prepared for, the prickly pear putting out blazing yellow flowers, the ocotillo erupting in scarlet, the broad flats of the lower pasture briefly carpeted in purple and gold. She stood on the eastern ridge one morning in late March and thought that her father would have loved this, and the grief and the gratitude existed simultaneously, which felt like the only honest way to carry the dead, not only in sorrow. She heard Calvin's horse on the rocky path below, and was not surprised when he appeared on the ridge beside her a few minutes later, having learned by now that she was often here in the mornings and having, somewhere in the past weeks, stopped pretending he didn't know that. He stood beside her and looked at the blooming land below, and she looked at his profile against the morning sky, the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself in the landscape as if he had grown from it directly, and she thought, very clearly and without fear, that she was in love with him. She had been for some time. It was not a problem and not a complication and not something she needed to manage. It was simply true. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. I've been thinking about the arrangement." Her heart did something that she chose to ignore. "What about it?" "I want to change it." She looked at him. "Which terms?" He turned to face her, and the expression on his face was the one she had seen that January morning, unguarded, raw, carrying everything he found most difficult to say directly. "All of them," he said. "I want to change all of them. I want Kate. I need to be honest with you because I don't know any other way to be, and I don't have any interest in trying. I told you when you arrived that I didn't have room for anything beyond the work, and that was true when I said it. But I was wrong about what the work was." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything he valued. "The land is mine. The ranch is mine. But the thing that makes it worth fighting for, the reason that water rights case mattered beyond the practical, the reason that January morning when Callahan threatened you, I went straight to Holt and said the word I said, that's not the land, that's you. And I don't know how to keep pretending otherwise." Kate looked at him for a long moment. The spring wind moved through the ridge grasses around them. Somewhere below, one of the horses made a sound that carried up clear and bright on the morning air. "I told you I didn't need a husband," she said. "I know. I told you I wanted a partnership. I know. I meant both of those things. I know that too. But," she said, and something in her voice shifted, "I have discovered that there are different kinds of partnerships. And the one we have." She stopped, and when she looked at him her eyes were clear and direct and carrying everything she had refused to let out for the last 6 months. "The one we have has become something I would not trade for anything. Not for independence, not for safety, not for the version of myself I thought I was protecting." She took a breath. "I love you, Calvin Blackwell. That is a statement of fact delivered with full awareness of my own history with poor decisions, and I am telling you that I have examined this one thoroughly from every angle, and I am confident it is not a poor decision." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, the kind she had heard rarely from him but had been paying attention to every time it happened, and it transformed his face in the way that real laughter transforms serious faces. It made him look younger and warmer and like the version of himself that existed underneath all the walls. "That's the most practical declaration of love I've ever heard," he said. "You said you weren't good at romantic," she said. "Neither am I. We can manage without it." "No," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping. "That's not entirely true." He reached up and pushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that was so at odds with the roughness of his hands and the harshness of the country they stood in that it made her breath catch. "I've had some practice lately." He kissed her on the ridge in the April morning with the blooming desert below them and the wide Arizona sky overhead, and it was different from the January kitchen kiss. This one was not the release of months of suppressed feeling but the beginning of something, a door opening deliberately into a space that had been prepared and was now ready. When they stepped back from each other, Kate put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not entirely steady. "So," she said. "So," he said. "If we're changing the arrangement," she said, "I want to be clear that I'm keeping the 40%. He started laughing again, and she was grinning, and the morning stretched around them bright and enormous, and the land below was theirs. They did not marry immediately. They were both too deliberate for that, too careful about the shape of their life together to rush into a ceremony simply because the feeling was certain. They spent the spring and summer in the happy, complex work of reconfiguring what they were to each other, still partners in the original sense, still equal authorities over the decisions that mattered, still the two people who met at the kitchen table at dawn and reviewed the day ahead with the same quiet efficiency, but now also something more and something warmer, something that included the sharing of small things as well as large ones. That included the particular luxury of having someone to tell the end of a day to. Kate wrote to her mother in Cincinnati to tell her what was happening and got back a letter full of complicated emotion. Her mother's happiness for her wrapped around a long-held guilt about the remarriage, about Gerald Fowler, about all the ways things had gone wrong before Kate went west. Kate replied honestly and without cruelty, the way she had learned from living beside Calvin to handle difficult truths. She told her mother that she was more completely herself in this country than she had ever been elsewhere, and that she had found something here that she hadn't known she was looking for, and that she hoped her mother could be glad for it. The letter she received back from her mother 2 months later was the beginning of something repaired between them, slow and careful, the way most important repairs were. Hector Ruiz and his wife, Maria, came to dinner one evening in June, which was not unusual, but Maria kept exchanging small private looks with Hector across the table in a way that indicated she was exercising significant restraint about something, and Kate noticed this and mentioned it after the meal when the two women were in the kitchen. "You see something," Kate said. "I see everything," Maria said comfortably, drying a dish. "I've watched that man be alone and be unhappy about it for 4 years, ever since his father died and there was nothing left to be angry at except the loneliness. And now he has that look." She glanced at Kate. "You know the one." "What look?" Maria smiled. "The look of a man who came in from the cold and found a fire and finally believes the cold is not the natural state of things." She set down the dish. "Hector says he works harder since you came. I say he works the same, but now he also rests. That is the difference." She patted Kate's hand with great authority. "You are good for this place and good for him. Do not let him convince you otherwise when he gets stubborn, because he will get stubborn." "I know," Kate said. "Good." The horse breeding program produced its first significant results in August, when 3 of the Blackwell mares threw foals that came out with exactly the build and temperament Calvin had been breeding toward, deep-chested, high-headed, with the particular combination of endurance and responsiveness that the cavalry required. A buyer came out from Fort Lowell in September, looked the young horses over with a professional eye, and placed an order for 6 animals to be ready in 18 months, and said he would be back for more. Calvin was quiet about it in the way he was quiet about things that mattered most, and Kate found him that evening by the horse fence watching the foals in the long late light of the September dusk, and she came and stood beside him. "Your father was right," she said. "He just didn't know it." Calvin reached out and took her hand and held it and said nothing for a long time, and she understood that silence perfectly. They were married in October of 1883, exactly 1 year after Kate Hawthorne had arrived in Redemption on the afternoon stage. The ceremony was in the small Redemption church, and it was attended by Hector and Maria Ruiz, by several of the ranch hands, by Deputy Marshal James Holt and his wife, by Philip Dawes, the lawyer who had come up from Tucson for the occasion, and by most of the town of Redemption, which had developed a collective opinion on the matter and considered itself invested. Kate wore a dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in Tucson, dark green that matched her eyes, practical enough to be comfortable and fine enough to be what the occasion required. She had done her own hair, which was not perfectly managed, and she didn't mind. Calvin wore his best suit, which had been brushed into respectability by Hector's wife with a degree of dedication that spoke to strong feelings about the event. When the minister asked if Calvin took Kate to be his wife, Calvin said yes, and then added in the quiet, deliberate voice he used when he meant something precisely, "And my partner." The minister blinked. Kate, standing across from him, felt something in her chest go warm and wide and full. When the minister asked if Kate took Calvin to be her husband, she said, "Yes, and my partner." Hector Ruiz in the second row looked straight ahead with extraordinary dignity. They rode back to the ranch together in the evening, the October air cool and clean, the big sky going dark above them with the first stars coming out, and Kate looked at the land they were riding through, the land she had helped fight for, the land that carried her father's name in the survey records, the land that was now in some real and legal and deeply personal sense hers. And she felt the particular happiness that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something that makes difficulty worth bearing. "Happy?" Calvin asked, in the simple, direct way he asked things when he already knew the answer. "Completely," she said. He reached across and touched her hand, the same way he had stood beside her at the horse fence the evening of the Fort Lowell buyer, and then they rode the rest of the way home in the kind of comfortable silence that is one of the finest gifts two people can give each other. The first year of their marriage was the year the Blackwell Ranch turned its corner, and it did so in the way that things turn corners in the real world, not all at once, but through a series of good decisions made by people who were paying attention. The water management system Kate had designed came fully online in the spring, opening up the new grazing sections as planned. The second round of cavalry horses went to Fort Lowell with commendations for quality. Calvin began laying the groundwork for a third grazing section by negotiating a land lease with a neighboring family who had more acres than they could currently use, a deal that was good for both sides and that he had approached with the straightforward fairness that was his primary mode of operation. Kate continued her survey work, taking contracts from the county for boundary assessments and from individual ranchers who needed professional land documentation. She had found that her father's 1874 survey maps were extraordinarily valuable, not just for the Blackwell water rights case, but as historical reference for a dozen disputes across Redemption County, and the reputation she had built through the Callahan case brought her more work than she could easily manage. She turned away nothing that she could fit around the ranch work, because the independence of it mattered to her, and Calvin understood that and never suggested it should be otherwise. She discovered in the second spring of their marriage that she was expecting a child. She told Calvin on a morning in March, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee in both hands, watching his face. He went very still in the way he went still when something was significant, and then he looked up from the table, and his expression had that quality she had learned to read as his deepest feelings, unguarded, direct, carrying more than he had words for. "Are you?" he started. "Yes," she said. "I've been certain for 2 weeks. I've been figuring out how I feel about it." "And I feel," she said carefully, "quite glad about it, which surprises me somewhat." She looked at him. "And you?" He stood up from the table and came around it and pulled her up out of her chair and held her, and she felt his arms close around her and his face press briefly against her hair, and there were no words, and no words were needed. Maria Ruiz, when she heard, wept with a joyful enthusiasm that Kate found both touching and slightly alarming. Hector clapped Calvin on the shoulder and said something in Spanish that made Calvin duck his head and smile. The ranch hands were told and responded with the particular combination of earnest congratulations and complete awkwardness that characterized young men receiving news of this kind, which made Kate laugh. The child was born in November of 1884, a boy they named Thomas after Kate's father, which made Kate cry in a way she had not expected, not out of grief, or not only, but out of something that felt like completion, like the continuation of something her father had started by coming west and teaching her to read land and love the open country, something that was now carried forward in this small new person who would grow up on this land, who would learn to read it from both his parents. Thomas Blackwell was a demanding infant with strong opinions about his schedule that did not necessarily coincide with anyone else's, and the first months were exhausting in the specific way that new parenthood is exhausting regardless of how competent or well-prepared you are. Kate discovered that Calvin's capacity for patience, which she had always known was considerable, extended to 3 in the morning colic with a steadiness that she found remarkable. He took his turns without being asked, without complaint, with the same reliable thoroughness he brought to every difficult task. "You didn't know you'd be good at this," Kate said one night, watching him walk the baby in the kitchen lamplight. "Neither did you," he said. "Fair enough," she said. Thomas grew, as children do, with an alarming speed that Kate found herself documenting carefully in a journal she had started keeping, not as a sentimental record exactly, but in the same way she documented land surveys, with precise observation and an eye for the significant detail. His first word was horse, which surprised no one who had watched Calvin carry him out to the fence to see the horses before the child was old enough to stand. His second word was mama, and Kate's feelings about that had nothing practical about them whatsoever. The ranch continued to grow. By 1886, the Blackwell horse breeding program was producing 20 animals a year for the cavalry and private buyers, and the quality reputation Calvin had built was attracting buyers from as far as California. Kate had expanded her survey work into a small land consulting business, working with the county and private clients, and had hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Ruth Vargas, who was the daughter of one of the ranch hands, and who had the same instinct for numbers and documents that Kate recognized from her own younger self. The cattle operation remained the foundation of the ranch's income, solid and reliable, and Calvin managed it with the same careful stewardship he brought to everything. Not overgrazing, not pushing for short-term gain at the expense of the land's long-term capacity, maintaining the quality of the herd through deliberate breeding decisions that were beginning to pay off in better prices per animal. It was Ruth who came running to find Kate one afternoon in the early spring of 1887, breathless and urgent, with a letter that had come on the stage from Tucson. The letter was from Philip Dawes, and it contained news about Royce Callahan. Callahan had appealed his conviction through a procedural challenge to the original warrant, and the appeal had been granted a hearing. The Yuma court had reviewed the case and found that one of the secondary charges, the coercion charge related specifically to the armed escort of Kate to the field tent, had been improperly framed under federal versus territorial jurisdiction. The conviction itself stood on the primary fraud charges, but Callahan's sentence had been reduced to 5 years, meaning he had already served sufficient time and was due to be released within 90 days. Dawes noted that this did not reverse any of the land fraud findings, that all the restored ranches remained with their original owners, and that Callahan had no remaining legal claim to anything in Redemption County. He was also apparently financially ruined. The Callahan Cattlemen's Company's assets had been seized as part of the fraud judgment, and the company was dissolved. He would be leaving Yuma as a man with a criminal record, no business, and limited resources. Dawes said he had no indication that Callahan intended any return to redemption, and that the legal risk to the Blackwells was effectively null. Kate read the letter twice, and then walked to the barn to find Calvin. He read it once, set it down, and was quiet for a moment. "He's done," Calvin said. "Financially, legally, there's nothing left for him to fight with." That's Dawes' assessment. Dawes is a careful man. If he says the legal risk is null, it's null. He folded the letter and handed it back to Kate. He's going to step out of Yuma with nothing and nowhere to go. That's a harder sentence than what the judge handed him. Kate looked at her husband and thought, not for the first time, that the quality of his fairness was remarkable, that he could see the full shape of a situation even when the person at the center of it had tried to destroy everything he loved. "Are you worried?" she asked. "No," he said, "not about Callahan." He paused, "but I am going to mention it to Holt." "I already sent him a telegram," Kate said. Calvin looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "Of course you did. What does that mean?" "It means I married the right person," he said. Holt confirmed within the week that Callahan had made no inquiries about redemption and had apparently departed Arizona territory entirely upon his release, relocating to relatives in Missouri. The threat, which had been effectively over since 1883, was now formally and permanently closed. Kate filed the news in the back of her mind in the same section where she kept other resolved difficulties, visible if she looked for them, no longer requiring attention. Their second child came in the spring of 1888, a girl they named Clara, and she arrived with a head of dark curly hair and Calvin's dark eyes and Kate's particular expression of considering you from across a room with great thoroughness before deciding what she thought of you. She was, from the first weeks of her life, entirely herself. Thomas, who was 3.5 when his sister arrived, examined her with the careful scientific interest of a small person encountering an unfamiliar phenomenon, and then announced that she was too small to be interesting, but that he supposed she could stay. Hector Ruiz's wife Maria wept again, with the same joyful enthusiasm as before, and Clara regarded her with a considering expression, and seemed to find the weeping reasonable. The ranch in 1888 was not the ranch Kate had arrived at in October of 1882. It was larger, better organized, more financially stable, and had a reputation across the territory that it had not had when she arrived. The horse breeding operation had become, as Calvin had predicted and as Kate had helped plan for, the primary engine of its success. The cavalry contracts were reliable and lucrative, and a growing market for quality ranch horses as the territory continued to develop meant that demand was increasing faster than their current capacity to meet it. They had hired 2 additional hands specifically for the horse operation, and Calvin was considering a modest expansion of the breeding barn. Kate had, over the same period, established what had become effectively the most reliable land survey and consulting practice in Redemption County. She had helped resolve 11 separate boundary and water rights disputes, had contributed to the documentation of 3 new homestead claims, and had been formally recognized by the county commissioners as a reference authority on historical land grants. A recognition that still made her smile when she thought about it, not from vanity, but from the particular satisfaction of having her father's work validated in the place it had been done. She and Calvin sat on the porch of the ranch house one August evening of 1888, which was a habit they had developed in recent years. The early evening hour before supper when the day's work was done, and the children were with Hector's wife, and the desert light went gold and long across the land below. It was not a practical time, which made it unusual for both of them, but they had each conceded that impractical things were sometimes the most essential. Thomas came tearing around the corner of the barn below them in pursuit of a large, unhappy chicken, and the chicken won the contest by approximately 6 feet, and Thomas sat down hard in the dust and decided that crying was the appropriate response to this. Calvin watched this sequence of events with an expression of studied neutrality. "He has your stubbornness," Kate said. "He has your determination," Calvin said. "Those are the same trait." "Yes," he said, "and they're going to make him extraordinary." Kate leaned her head briefly against Calvin's shoulder in the way she had learned to do, not leaning out of weakness, but out of the kind of ease that comes from knowing someone completely and being completely known by them, which is a different kind of closeness than any other and carries its own particular luxury. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the Northeast Survey. The Arroyo country. She paused. You remember what I said to my father's maps when I first saw this place, that the land was being read by someone who loved it. I remember. I want to map the full property, properly. A comprehensive survey, not just the sections we've been working piecemeal. Everything from the ridge down to the south pasture with the water features and the topographic detail and the land use notation. She looked out at the land. It should exist. It should be on record, for Thomas and for Clara. Another pause, and for your father. Calvin was quiet for a moment. It's also just good land management, she added. I know, he said, it's both things. It's always both things with us. He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was still, after 6 years of marriage and 2 children, and a fought-for ranch, and a life built together from the ground up, slightly amazed. As if she continued to surprise him. As if the fact of her here in this life was something he had not entirely expected and had not entirely stopped marveling at. Kate, he said. Calvin, she said. I want to. He stopped, tried again. I don't always have the words. I know. But I want you to know that this, he gestured, a small imprecise gesture at the porch and the land and the evening light and the child currently climbing back up from the dust below them, and the whole shape of the life they had made. This is everything. This is, I don't know how else to say it, everything I thought I couldn't have. Everything I told myself wasn't possible and wasn't allowed and wasn't. He stopped again. Wasn't in the arrangement, she said softly. Yes, he said. Not in the arrangement. She took his hand. Lucky for both of us that we were willing to renegotiate. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so careful and deliberate that it undid her every time, and she felt the full warm weight of the life they had built settling around her like something permanent. Lucky, he agreed. The survey she proposed became a project of the autumn of 1888, a joint effort that lasted 3 months, and took them across every acre of the Blackwell Ranch in a systematic documentation that Kate executed with her father's instruments and her own experience and Calvin's specific intimate knowledge of the land they were mapping. Thomas came on the easier sections, serious and small, carrying the survey rod with enormous self-importance and asking questions that Kate answered fully, and Calvin supplemented with the practical knowledge of a man who had walked this land in every season and condition. The final map was 3 feet by 4, drawn on the best cartographic paper Kate had ordered from a supplier in San Francisco, inked in her precise hand with a clarity and detail that made Philip Dawes, when he saw it in the spring, say that it was the finest private land survey he had encountered in 20 years of territorial law. Kate had it framed and hung it on the wall of the ranch house common room. Underneath it, in the border notation and the small, careful script she had inherited from her father, she had written, Blackwell Ranch, Redemption County, Arizona Territory, surveyed and documented 1888. T.H. Hawthorne, 1821-1877, original survey 1874. K.H. Blackwell, Survey and Documentation 1888. Calvin stood in front of it for a long time the evening it went up, and Kate stood beside him, and he put his arm around her waist and pulled her close, and the evening light through the window made long, warm rectangles on the floor of the room they had made a home of. Your father's work, he said. And mine, she said. And yours. And Thomas's a little, since he carried the rod the whole northwest section without dropping it once. She paused. And Clara's by inheritance. Calvin looked at the map for another long moment, and then he looked at Kate, and she met his eyes and felt the same thing she felt every time he looked at her, like that, a kind of fullness, a completeness, the particular satisfaction of having found something real and true in a world that contained a great deal of pretending. Partner, he said, which was the word they used for each other still by preference, because it had always meant more than the alternatives. Partner, she said. Outside the ranch house, the Arizona Territory spread in every direction under a sky full of winter stars, and the horses moved quietly in the dark pasture, and the creek ran on its restored and legal course toward the south, and the land that had been fought for and surveyed and documented and loved lay under the first cold of the season in its own kind of peace. In the spring of 1890, Kate discovered she was expecting their third child. She told Calvin on the eastern ridge, where the ocotillo was blooming again, and he pulled her close and held her with the same warmth as always, steady and certain and entirely himself. Thomas, now 5, received the news with a measured acceptance and asked if this one could be a brother since he already had a sister, a preference Kate noted with amusement and made no promises about. Clara, at 2, had no opinion on the subject but looked at everyone with her considering dark eyes as if she was tracking the situation carefully. The third child, born in November, was in fact a boy, and they named him William after Calvin's father. He had Kate's green eyes and Calvin's jaw, and from his first weeks was clearly going to have opinions about the world that he intended to express at volume. Thomas received him with the magnanimity of a person whose preferences have been accommodated, and was thereafter a devoted and bossy older brother. Clara observed the new arrival with her habitual thorough assessment, and then appeared to decide he was acceptable. The ranch in 1890 was a different scale than the ranch of 1882. It was not dramatically larger in acres. They had added the lease sections and one additional parcel purchased outright, but it was dramatically more productive, more organized, and more financially stable. The horse breeding operation was at 30 animals a year and growing. The cattle herd was 2/3 larger. Kate's land consulting practice had expanded to 3 counties and required her to hire a full-time assistant, Ruth Vargas having gone on to run the land office in Redemption itself, a position she was extremely good at and which Kate privately considered one of her better achievements. The town of Redemption had grown as well, in the decade since Kate had first stepped off the stage. It had a second general store now, a proper hotel, a public school where Thomas was among the first students, and where Kate had been on the founding committee, with a degree of involvement that the other committee members had quickly learned to regard as comprehensive. The school had a good library, including a full set of survey maps of the territory, donated by the Blackwell Ranch with a placard acknowledging their historical origin. Philip Dawes had retired from his Tucson practice and moved to Redemption, where he was the town's only lawyer, and worked with a volume of land cases that kept him constantly occupied and apparently quite happy. James Holt had been appointed full district marshal and had moved his family to the county seat, but came through Redemption regularly and always stopped for dinner at the Blackwell Ranch when he did, a tradition that had developed naturally and that Kate considered both practical and pleasant. Hector Ruiz had turned 65 and had officially declared himself semi-retired, which in practice meant he worked 4 days a week instead of 7, and delegated to his deputy foreman, a capable young man named Santos who had grown up in Redemption and learned the ranch's ways over 8 years. Maria Ruiz had never stopped feeding everyone who came within range of her kitchen, and the Sunday dinner at the Ruiz house remained one of the fixed points of the week's calendar. Kate sat at the kitchen table one evening in the early December of 1890, with Thomas doing his school arithmetic on one side of her, and Clara arranging small stones in a pattern she had apparently decided was significant on the other side, and young William asleep in the small room just off the kitchen, and she could hear Calvin in the barn talking to one of the horses. That low, steady voice he used with the animals, the same voice he used with the children when they were upset. The same voice he had used with her that January morning when everything between them had cracked open and let in the light. She thought about the advertisement in the Tucson Gazette, wanted, a capable partner. No permanent ties required. She thought about the letter she had written in return, frank and precise, listing her qualifications and acknowledging her gender and saying plainly that she intended to be taken seriously. She thought about the 6 miles of conversation on the road to the ranch, and the 2 hours of negotiation at the kitchen table, and the signed agreement with its 40% and its 90-day dissolution clause, and the morning she had thrown it back across the table at him with shaking hands. She thought about everything that had been built since then, not just the ranch, not just the water rights and the horse operation and the land surveys and the 3 children asleep or nearly so, but the actual fundamental thing, the thing underneath all the practical successful accomplishment, the partnership that was the deepest kind possible between 2 people, built on honesty and equal ground and the willingness to renegotiate when the original terms turned out to be incomplete. She had said that a clean professional arrangement was fine by her. She had meant it entirely. And then life had revised her understanding of what fine actually meant, and she had followed that revision without letting her pride or her history make the decision for her. And she had arrived here, at this table in this house, in this land, with this man coming in from the barn now, stomping the evening cold off his boots, smelling of horses and winter air. Calvin came through the door and looked at the kitchen tableau, Thomas's arithmetic, Clara's stones, the sleeping baby's soft noise from the side room, Kate at the table with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and the expression that moved through his face was the one she knew best of all his expressions, the one that said he was aware of his own luck and taking nothing for granted. He hung his coat, poured his coffee, sat down at the table across from her in the chair that was his in the same unceremonious permanent way that everything about their life together had settled into exactly the right place. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. Thomas looked up from his arithmetic. "Papa, what is 14 times 7? "Work it out," Calvin said. "You have the method." Thomas frowned at his paper. Clara offered Calvin a small stone, which he accepted with complete seriousness and examined carefully before placing it on the table with a nod of approval. Kate watched all of this and felt the happiness that was not loud, but was absolutely complete, the happiness of a life that was fully hers, built on terms she had set and renegotiated and set again, beside a person who had meant what he said and learned, as she had, that what he said sometimes needed to grow to accommodate what was true. He said he didn't want a wife. She said that was fine by her. And then the truth of 2 honest people turned out to be larger than either of them had budgeted for, and the arrangement they had signed in good faith on a cold October evening had become, through the ordinary miraculous accumulation of shared work and shared risk and shared mornings on a ridge above a blooming desert, something neither of them had the words for, which meant it was the real thing. Outside the window, the December stars came out over Redemption County, Arizona Territory, over the Blackwell Ranch with its 12,000 surveyed acres and its horse pastures and its creek running free. And inside the lamplit kitchen, 2 partners sat across a table from each other in the comfortable, productive, endlessly interesting silence of people who know each other all the way down, and have decided that is exactly the person they want to know. Thomas got his arithmetic right. Calvin verified it and told him so without ceremony. Clara fell asleep on her pile of stones with the absolute unconsciousness of small children, and Calvin picked her up and carried her to bed, and Kate checked on William and found him still deeply and satisfactorily asleep. And when she came back to the kitchen, Calvin was at the table with the ranch accounts spread out in front of him, same as any evening, same as every evening, and she sat down across from him with her surveying notes from the current county contract. And they worked in the quiet lamplight until the fire needed banking, and the night had gone fully deep. Before they blew out the lamp, Calvin looked up from the accounts at Kate, and Kate looked up from her notes at Calvin, and no particular words were necessary. The land lay around them in the dark, known and documented and loved and defended, and the life they had made on it was complete.